fairly quickly. The first one, in case I haven't mentioned this with you guys, is that you can totally render, if you're ever using a, what am I saying? If you ever have like an HDR in an image, so I'm just gonna like throw in a sky dome light, and say it's perfect for your lighting, does awesome stuff, and then you're like, it looks terrible, like the scenery itself makes no sense in the background of my scene, it's rendering really blurry, or I just like want to, you know, put another object in there. You can actually turn that off in the render, which I forgot to mention last week. So I'm just gonna set my project to mash play, because I have files stashed in there. So I'm just gonna throw in an HDR and be like, awesome. It's such a gorgeous render of a sphere on a plane. Practically speaking, if this was, you know, like an HDR, again, for like the background of your final and you didn't want the HDR showing up because it looked weird, again, there's a way to turn this off so it doesn't show up in your render but will still light your scene. So if I select my HDR light, scroll down to visibility, literally just set camera down to 0. And you can see, like, it's still lighting my scene, it's just not showing up in the render. And if I look at my alpha channel, you'll see that the geometry is showing up as not transparent, and the background is pretty much just transparent. So this would be really easy to, again, just like you go in Photoshop and just like throw this on top of a generic random window texture you liked, and pretty much like the easiest way to comp in a background in your render ever. So, I mean, that's pretty much that. It's just visibility under the camera. You can also, if you want to, play with like, basically, this is like how much it affects the diffuse and specular and like all this other stuff, but practically speaking, I like the camera one the most. Any questions on that? All right. Yeah, so I just have like, again, a few very random, like super quickie tutorials like that I want to run through. The other one is you can kind of make fake pixel art in Arnold. This is going to be a weird demonstration because it's just a sphere. But if you open your render settings and you go to Arnold Render, set the anti-aliasing down like super low. So you know, if I set this to -3, it just like looks pixely. You can set it to, you know, even like lower stuff like -5 if you are so inclined. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing this for like pretty renders, but one thing you can do is if you had a character, like an animated rigged character or whatever, doing a walk cycle, and you wanted to convert that into pixel art, you could basically go through and just like render them out with very, very low anti-aliasing, and it would essentially make you sprites of that character just like walking along doing its thing. Practically speaking, I'm not sure how useful this actually would be, but I just thought it was like a cool sort of weird thing that you can do. Any random questions on that? All right. Other thing I want to go over really quickly is how to feather the edges of your ground plane so that they blend in a little bit better with HDRIs. So this is like a thing. So if you're ever going to have just like an object floating on a plane, floating on an or like an object on a plane floating on an HDRI, even if I'm going to go back in and just add, it's going to be kind of janky looking, but I'm just going to, you know, turn this some kind of color that sort of matches my HDR and like maybe turn the roughness way down. And like nothing I do is like really going to camouflage this seam like properly. I can kind of go through and like feather this a little bit. Basically what I'm going to do is turn the ground into a card and just add, again, a little bit of like noise around the edge to help break up the super hard line of this plane. So you can make your own custom textures for this, like, you know, Photoshop textures if you want. I'm just going to show you how to do it kind of janky procedural way in Maya. So I'm going to go down to the Geometry tab where we find our opacity for cards. And I'm going to map into that a ramp shader. I love ramp shaders. You'll also notice that nothing happens, and that is because I need to tell Arnold that this object is opaque. And look, now it doesn't show up in your render at all. anyway, I'm gonna go back to my ramp. I'm going to just like fiddle with the conventional settings. So notice like as I fiddle with the slider, you can see kind of that like the ramp is becoming more or less transparent in certain areas. And this is basically the principle I'm going to use. I'm just going to use, instead of a V ramp, I'm going to set this to, sure, I'm going to set this to a circular ramp. There's also a bunch of other ones you can use, but I'm just going to use this one for now. So the first thing, I want the, where have I put that? Shoot. What was I just doing? All right. Haha. I would like the edges to be a little bit more feathered, so I'm just going to take this black area and like pull it in a little bit. And you can see that now I have like a relatively sort of feathered edge. You can see like, especially like down here, I mean the shadow aside, it does blend in a little bit more nicely with the background. One thing you can do if you want to even sort of eat into that edge a little bit more is go in and add a noise texture into this. So in case I haven't mentioned this before, you can map whatever into ramp. Like I could map a file texture into this one slider of the ramp if I wanted to, and show you like Nicolas Cage's face on like a gradient on this thing. I don't know. But you can use like other ramp shaders. You can use, in this case, I'm going to use a noise texture. So I'm going to grab that. And you can see that as soon as I do that, it gets a little bit more of like a sort of feathered edge on that plane. And again, just sort of helps kind of blend it a little bit better, kind of into the background. So this is like good to do if you're, you know, putting like a grass plane on top of like a giant grass HDRI. It'll, again, just make it look a little bit more polished rather than just sort of having a very clear edge of your plane in there. It also probably makes sense, strictly speaking, to do this in Photoshop. It'll give you like a little bit of a more targeted effect rather than this random noise texture. But you can do it like this, and I do it like this a lot if I'm just trying to be quick about it. There's also, I think, another box ramp. Yeah, you can also use box ramps if you don't want a circular cutout of this plane. But yeah, I mean, that's more or less that. Pretty much just turning the ground into your card. Any questions on that? All right. You can also, if you were so inclined, go in and turn off your HDRI. And this is pretty much what it looks like just on black. I didn't do a great job feathering the edges. But if you look at the alpha for that, you'll see that I could dump this onto any other image. And whatever image I put in the background is going to show up through all these like little black cruddy areas in here. It's good to be aware that you can do that, I guess. And again, it does really help make stuff kind of look more polished than just having it sitting on a black plane, especially if you're doing like a targeted scene that's like just a standalone thing you're going to put in a Sketchfab or something. Doing this can really help give it a little bit more polished look. Yeah. Anyway, any questions on that? All right. Cool. I have like 2 other silly quick fake tutorials for you guys. The first one is, I'm pretty sure that I've gone over at least something similar-ish before, but basically how to make a cheap ground plane. So the first way is to do it manually, where I basically just grab, you know, a component on this, turn on soft select. I'm using B to just toggle that on and off. And if you press and hold B and then drag with your middle mouse button, you can expand the radius of effect. But if you wanted like a very specific, you know, hill structure or whatever, like this, you could make that with soft select. For, you know, entire environments, this isn't necessarily the most effective way to do anything. In which case, I would usually use some kind of texture deformer for that. So I'm just gonna undo all of that and go into my, just click on my object and deform menu, and texture deformer. And quickest thing that you can possibly do for this is to literally just throw on another noise texture, which apparently are like my favorite things ever. But now you have a very sort of strange looking little lumpy ground, or you could use this for water if you wanted to animate it, like that. Actually, I have a tutorial on that floating around on YouTube if anyone's interested. But yeah, so this is again good if you're just doing, you're adding ground to something and you're like, I'm not really feeling just having a flat plane for a field. Or even if you're modeling, you know, a garden bed with some mulch, you could even just sort of throw a very tiny noise texture on to break up the surface a little bit and like give a little bit more kind of like punch to the texture, I guess. But yeah, you can also, if you're so inclined, do these with more specific textures. So I don't know where the heck I found this, but somewhere on the internet I found, oh lord, I found a really dense, or like a basically height map of the world. I don't understand like why. I'm not gonna lie, I probably spent 10 minutes trying to find that for some reason, but I found it was, if you're in the MASH play, if you're following along, it's the land height file. But it's pretty much just this. It's literally just a height map of the Earth. If I was so inclined, I could use that as a texture deformer in Maya, and then you pretty much just have a height map of the Earth, wonderfully, like without pretty much any effort at all. Grab land height and give it a sec. All right, and you can see again now that we have some like real weird texturing happening. And this goes for texture deformers in general, especially if you're applying them to a curved surface. If you ever get this like weird thing where it's like kind of pulling straight up instead of going, you know, outward like you might expect it to, just go into your texture deformer, and where it says direction, usually by default for some reason it's set to handle. That's just going to look at the pretty much y-axis of your little rotation gimbal thing. What you want to set that to probably is normal, and you can see that as soon as I set it to that, it's moving outwards from the circle based on the normals of the faces rather than just sort of like pulling all the stuff straight up in the air. So now Antarctica is like actually looks like Antarctica instead of being sucked up into the globe. And look, like it's the Rockies and stuff. But yeah, so you can do weird stuff like that. Practically speaking, if any of you are into 3D printing and or tabletop gaming with props, you could totally draw your own terrain map manually as just like a black and white height map, and then throw it on a texture deformer, cut up your model, 3D print it, and then you have like your custom world that you made. So that's pretty much cheap terrain. Any questions on that? All right, cool. All right, I think the only other thing that I want to go over